Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I think we're going to begin. It's exactly 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So good afternoon and good morning to everyone. And thank you for joining us for today's special webinar delivered on behalf of the Extension Disaster Education Network's Professional Development Committee. My name is Joyce McGarry. I'm a food safety educator for Michigan State University Extension. Please take a moment to drop your name and institution in the chat box so we know who is with us today. Today, our presentation will be a case study of an extension response to a severe wildlife season before, during, and after. And our speaker is Bill Warren from the University of Idaho. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them in the chat box in your Zoom control panel. I'll bring them up at the end of the presentation. And I'd also like to note that in the chat box is the URL for the evaluation and that this Zoom will be recorded. Bill Warren is an associate professor and extension educator for the University of Idaho. Bill conducts programming in land-based economic development and land stewardship in Clearwater and nearby Idaho counties. Landowners learn how to generate income from their land while enhancing ecological benefits. Bill is also the Eden point of contact for the University of Idaho. So, enough of me talking now, Bill. Go ahead, it's all yours.
All right, thanks a lot, Joyce, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. I'm just going to get right in here to the presentation. Going to kind of minimize my pictures there of folks so I can see my slides. So the purpose of the presentation is just to give an example of what I've done. I've been doing wildland fire programming for about the last 9 years. And we had one particularly really severe, historic really for this part of Idaho in 2015 when we had fires. And so my presentation will talk about my risk reduction programming as well as a response to that particular fire season. And it's just hope that you know, folks that do this type of programming across the country can maybe get some ideas and things to consider for doing programming in your own location. One thing I will point out is that my programming is in terms of the risk reduction as well as during that fire season of 2015 was just focused on land owners and damage to their land and in some extent ag and ranching infrastructure. I was not involved with people who lost their homes and recovery of people who lost their homes. There were community groups that did focus on that, but the effort that I participated in and led just dealt with the natural resource damage. So just the basic outline, it's pretty simple. I'll talk about a little bit about risk reduction programming prior to the fire season that I typically do every year, and then the response to the severe wildfire season we had in 2015, and then just to share with you some lessons learned, and also a mention of some other scholarly literature that's been done on this aspect of emergency response. So prior to the fire season, every year we typically do a couple of these programs around the area of north central Idaho. And this is a curriculum that I developed. It's been very successful based on surveys of attendees. We have had documented 100% compliance of the people who take this. They go home around their structures and their infrastructure and take these measures. So it's been very successful from that standpoint. Just basically, I will lead off this with a large-scale overview of wildfire in the Western U.S., its history, the causes and statistics on its dramatic increase in the last couple of decades, and all the reasons for that, and so on. Then I turn to some wildland fire professionals who do this as their living to talk about wildland fire behavior and how wildland firefighters respond to wildland fire in the wildland-urban interface, or the WUI. Then I have another fire professional with our Idaho Department of Lands talking about landscaping and structural modification around the homes. This presentation has a lot of video from the insurance industry that have done tests on embers and how they can enter the home through cracks and vents in the attic and so on and so forth, and document how ember storms actually are the main cause of structural loss during wildfires. And so a lot of pictures documenting on what to do, what not to do in that, and also some pictures of some actual wildfires that actually overtook homes and took homes out. So it's pretty dramatic. It really gets people's attention. But then we offer solutions on how you can prevent this from happening to your home. And then we also have a representative. It depends on the county. In this case, it's Idaho County representative or director of their emergency management, talks about the wildfire protection plans for that particular county, and then the emergency response. So it's very comprehensive. Again, very high attendee evaluations and compliance with the recommended measures. The one problem that I will say that we have with this, and I've heard this from other wildland fire programming people, it's hard to get a lot of people to turn out for these. Even prior to a very dry and what's forecast to be a bad fire season, it's just really hard to get people to turn out. One thing that, and I don't know all the causes for that, might be a good study of why some people are not that concerned perhaps with it. But one thing I have done to supplement this is to kind of package it. It's not nearly as comprehensive a program. You know, you're talking about 20, 30-minute presentation, and go to community groups where you've got a captive audience of programming with that to try to reach a larger audience. So just to give you the context here, let's see, get the annotation instrument here. I'll try this. So this area right here is kind of what we call as north central Idaho, and this is the general area that I'll zoom in on and talk about the wildfire response in 2015. Okay, I think I have to double click before it'll let me advance. That's not even in my slide set. Huh, weird. Okay, so north central Idaho wildfire conditions in 2015. So 2015, we had record drought and record weather. Very low humidities, warmest June, 120 years, classified as extreme drought. And then on August 10th, we had a lightning storm with 97 lightning strikes recorded in 1 hour and 2,500 strikes in a 24-hour period. And if that wasn't enough, on August 14th, we had a major wind event that led to extreme wildfire behavior, and that's when most of the homes were lost in local communities. That's just a shot from an airplane on August 10th. You can see the smoke plumes. There were 22 fires on Idaho Department of Land Fire Protection Area, which is in the front country, kind of off most of the national forest lands, and then over 150 fires on Forest Service protection. And this is a map of the named fires in this area. And you can see there were a lot of named fires from those lightning strikes that developed. The fires that are colored in yellow are the fires that I will focus on in my presentation and what were the focus of the response that we had. So what was different about 2015 is that these fires in yellow were largely in the front country. They were off industrial timberland for the most part, and they were off state and federal land. They were on private land, non-industrial, private forest landowners and ranchers' land. This is what was unique about 2015. And as you might guess, individual landowners don't have the resources of the Forest Service or the State Lands Department to mitigate the damage to their natural resources on their land. So that's what precipitated our involvement. So these are just a few pictures. You can see some of the areas that were burned were extreme, very severe wildfire, not really any vegetation at all left. There's a slide of a culvert, a poly culvert. The Forest Service and other landowners had actually had many of these in some of their roads that all had to be replaced at great expense. It's quite expensive to replace a culvert, but this is what happened to them from the heat in some of these severe fire areas. So just kind of an overview of the impact. We had 280,000 acres burned in north central Idaho. Most of that was on federal land, but we had 60,000 acres of private land that also burned. We had 64 homes lost. We had 1 fatality and over 200 non-residential structures and over 200 miles of fence lost. Now, these numbers in terms of homes and so on may not sound like a lot. This area of Idaho compared to California is very low population density. Two of the primarily affected counties during 2015, Idaho and Clearwater County, have a combined area larger than 8 states, but a total population of under 25,000. So the impacts and some of the, both in terms of the fire and of the programming, the numbers might seem small, but from our area, it was a major event that impacted a lot of rural landowners. Idaho actually ranks near the top over time in wildfire acres burned, but you don't hear about it much in the press because there's so much backcountry and wilderness area in Idaho that most of those fires do not affect people in homes. And so we don't get in the press as much as California, but we do have a lot of wildfire and large fires in Idaho. 2015, I'll just mention, was also a record wildfire year for the nation at that time. So going into what our response was when these fires started, so we were requested by the county commissioners to oversee volunteers that were coordinating the housing of domestic animals that had to be evacuated because of the wildfires. These were at the Fair Barn, at the Clearwater County Fairgrounds is where that took place. I met with leaders of the incident command for the Clearwater Complex fires. That's what those fires were called that were in the yellow there, were combined under an incident command structure to obtain data on the natural resource damage that was occurring, where the more severe fires were on the private lands, again, focused on the non-industrial private lands. And then meetings began with other agency personnel and county commissioners in adjacent counties to craft a multi-agency coordinated response to this damage on private lands. And this all occurred spontaneously. I want to emphasize there was nothing pre-planned about this. No one that I worked with had really been through anything like this before. So the pre-fire season risk reduction programming, that's planned, something we do every year. But this was completely unplanned, spontaneous reaction to this extraordinary event for our area. So the major challenges were the urgency of natural resource response required on private land due to degradation of burned timber, bark beetle infestation, landslide and erosion risk, and the loss of forage for livestock. And again, just mentioning there was no institutional process for post-fire natural resource damage assessment and recovery on private land. There was no state agency or organization or template for how to do this. We just kind of invented it on the fly. So while the fires were still burning, as I mentioned, we developed this grassroots sort of spontaneous mobilization and coordination of agency scientists to assess natural resource damage and inform inform the public and landowners. And then the Extension Office in Clearwater County became the point of contact for information exchange and interagency coordination and to the press. So, you know, I can't tell you exactly how this happened. I know with these early meetings with the incident command folks and with county commissioners, with a few other county department folks in weed management, about all I can remember. I probably, if I went through my file cabinet, could reconstruct this in detail, but I know I volunteered to send out some emails and keep a few people informed, and it just kind of grew from that initial outreach to where we had an email list of 100 agency scientists and agency and community leaders, and that coordinated. We even had a volunteer group of retired U.S. Forest Service personnel who were trained experts in post-fire assessment that went onto private land and did this. We had Forest Service personnel who pitched in, their supervisor of the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, kind of a think out of the box leader. She had her personnel pitch in and help private lands, even though that was not part of their job title. And so all this had to be coordinated. So by my initial offer to send out emails and get information out to people, it just spontaneously created this large email list, and I became the point of contact. And so people needing information would contact me either by phone and email. Any people from the National Weather Service, from FEMA down in Boise, all over to what was going on with the post-fire assessment. And then other people would feed me information, and I would periodically send out these update emails. And in the first few weeks, there were several of these per week that I would send out, and more people asked to be on this. So it was kind of maintaining what was going on for the public and other agencies in how we were responding to this disaster on public lands or private lands. So the other thing we did, we distributed fire recovery information packets to landowners, and we did this largely through libraries, Idaho Department of Lands offices, county courthouses throughout this multi-county area. We also published a special edition of our Extension newsletter. We have a quarterly newsletter, and we published a special edition of this with information on fire recovery and how you could get assistance from other agencies on the natural resource end. And we have through our, county assessors databases from the surrounding counties, which we do to market our just normal extension programs. And with those databases, we were able to zero in on rural landowners that were in these fire affected areas, so we could target our mailing of this newsletter. We sent out 2,600 of those. So just some more things that we began immediately after the fires. We conducted 16 public information sessions in collaboration with other agencies to get recovery assistance information to landowners. So what we brought together, NRCS, FSA, Idaho Department of Lands, you name it, these agencies, county emergency management, that might have money, that might have programs for helping these people assess the damage on their land, was part of that. And then later, we had information for landowners, educational information on actions they could take on their own land. We had site visits to landowners by BEAR teams and other natural resource damage assessment professionals that was coordinated through our office. We maintained lines of communication with the press. We had about 6 weeks of informal interagency collaboration through Extension, led to a formal interagency and intergovernmental group on October 8th, which was called the North Central Idaho Wildfire Restoration Group. So one of the things that happened early on is all these agency staff people were spending all this time on wildfire recovery on private land when that really wasn't their job description. So it became apparent that agency directors were going to need to be directly involved to repurpose employees to address this private land wildfire recovery, which ended up taking many months. In fact, the next bullet there, we went into an interagency scientific team that conducted a detailed post-fire assessment, 2-volume, 865-page natural resource damage inventory on these private lands that took 14 months. The other thing that we did in the following year, we conducted a conference that communicated the initial results of natural resource damage assessment to the public, and that was in the spring of 2016. So these are just some examples, so this was like the cover of that special newsletter we sent out to 2,600 landowners that had articles in it by different agency people specifically addressing post-fire recovery. Here's one of the pages, just a list of contacts for people. So they have the numbers and locations of various agencies that they could contact to see how they might have some financial or technical assistance from these agencies to help them. This is just one of the many articles we had in here by an NRCS range specialist, just talking about pasture and range recovery after wildfire. This is just a flyer for the fire assistance and programs that we had for rural landowners. We had 5 of these. You can see all the agencies represented there. And these were information on what the various agencies' services or programs or financial assistance the different agencies had for landowners. And again, all this was coordinated and put on through our extension office. Then this is just an example of some of the educational programs. For example, this one is on salvage logging and erosion control. Many private landowners, much of their net worth is in their standing timber. And so when it's burned, if they don't get that off quickly, it degrades, and so they're losing a lot of their net worth and their future financial ability if they don't get these areas logged in a timely manner. So this was a program put on to give information so they can do this type of salvage logging responsibly and prevent erosion and so on and so forth. We even had programs on some of the things you might not think on, but just the implications for property and income taxes and insurance, for insurance implications for forest landowners who lost much of their timber. So we brought in CPAs and other tax specialists from the state to talk about these implications for private landowners. And then this is just a example brochure and agenda from the conference that we held the following spring. We brought in some fire ecologists and top people with the state to talk about the results and some of the national initiatives that are going on to address wildfire, multi-agency initiatives. This is just a listing of some of the partners that were involved in not only the initial effort, but in the development of the scientific report that tried to document the damage on the private lands. And you can see it includes local conservation districts, county government, state government, federal government, and tribal government were all involved in this effort. So kind of to summarize so far is you could think of it as kind of a 4-track response that Extension had for this wildfire. We did, as I mentioned, the wildfire risk reduction programming was done prior to the wildfire seasons. The second track was overseeing volunteers for evacuated farm animals at the request of county government. The other thing, this wasn't done in my county, but there were also some big wild range fires down in southern Idaho. A couple of other county extension offices provided clearinghouses for hay that were donated to ranchers who had lost their pasture or rangeland so they could feed their cattle. So there were 2 other extension offices that also did that. Then the third track was this role of interagency coordination and information hub for fire-caused natural resource damage and a point of contact for the press as well as other agencies. And this was this kind of spontaneous thing. You don't maybe think of Extension normally wouldn't do something like this, but in our case in Idaho, where we had no template, we had no state or local agency that was designed to coordinate recovery on private land. It was just an opportunity for Extension to step in and provide some impact to this situation. And I think that the reason that Extension was able to successfully lead this interagency effort was because Extension was viewed as non-competitor. When this formal group, as I'll share in a subsequent slide, formed, there were some sort of interagency politics, but at this early level, I think extension was viewed on as neutral. And so it didn't ruffle the feathers maybe of some of these other agencies to have extension leading it. And although I was already doing this on my own, there was an interagency group that met, and after the fact, they wanted to make sure I kept doing it and actually sent a letter to my supervisor requesting that I keep doing what I was already doing. So we definitely served the need in these early couple of months of the wildfire aftermath. And then kind of what extension normally does is this major information and education program response to get fire recovery information directly to the affected landowners. So here's what I would say are some of the major accomplishments is first, this kind of innovative grassroots multi-agency collaboration that was kind of created on the fly without any pre-planning that responded in a timely manner to public need. We did have the formation of the North Central Idaho Wildfire Restoration Group a couple of months in. That was, I was a member of this, as well as agency directors and county government, county commissioners. The local Soil and Water Conservation District Division 2, which is the 5 counties in north central Idaho, actually went to the legislature. They got $100,000 to fund this North Central Idaho Wildfire Restoration Group's efforts. The lion's share of that went to this scientific assessment. We had new interagency relationships formed, producing a model for the next fire recovery effort. A lot of these agencies had never worked together before on anything like this, so it created some new ground for interagency collaboration. I mentioned the fire assessment report that was completed. We certainly had greater awareness among the landowning public of the resources and assistance that was available. And then based on our evaluations at these workshops, we hopefully had better decision-making by landowners conducting fire recovery activities on their land. So I'll just go into some lessons learned, some of the good things, some of the disappointments. Some of the good things were, of the lessons learned, were the importance of creating relationships before a disaster. So I had been very involved in wildfire risk reduction programming, as I mentioned, for several years. So I was kind of a known entity among some agency people, and kind of how my name came up with the incident command team to get in on the early process of generating data on the damage to private land. I'm also a member of the Clearwater Basin Collaborative, which is a major federal land collaborative with environmental groups, forest industry, county government, etc., recreation groups to try to resolve differences on the management of federal land. So I know my county emergency management director. I had been involved with some of the fire people in my pre-fire season programming. So I had these relationships built before we ever had a fire season like this that kind of set the stage for allowing me to create impact from extension. I think the other thing that I found is I would recommend is having a flexible strategic programming focus. So my focus is economic development on land-based economic development and land stewardship. I interpret that pretty broadly. I kind of take a socio-ecological paradigm in my natural resource programming that looks at the interface between rural, social, and economic health and the natural resource base. And so I think I was able to shift my programming. Again, this was completely unplanned. We didn't know we were going to have this kind of extreme wildfire. And I think being able to shift your programming rapidly and seize the opportunity, as it were, to create impact is important. Time is of the essence. You kind of have to figure it out as you go. You know, there's that term, the fog of war, when everything is happening quickly, many balls are in the air, and you just kind of have to jump in and do it. There could be some discomfort if not knowing all the right things to do, but time is of the essence in this kind of situation. I think one of the lessons is importance of particular personalities among agency leaders. You know, we have some innovative leaders, especially with our federal lands in the area, particularly with the Forest Service. And I think also with some of our other agencies, our soil and water conservation districts. If you hadn't had those particular personalities that saw an opportunity to think outside the box, repurpose federal employees to helping on private land and being good neighbors for their community, it may not have happened as well as it did. And there's some other research I'm doing right now on a different topic, but it involves the Forest Service and their management. And one of the things of that research is showing is the importance of personality. It's kind of like difference in football teams or sports teams. Some of them go to the playoffs and some of them don't. And so particular people do make a difference in how agencies and entities respond to something like this. I think it also the lesson of importance of removing barriers to interagency cooperation and information sharing. And as I mentioned before, I think extension being perceived as neutral helped facilitate some of this. And then the need for decision makers, as we found out, to be directly involved to redirect staff work assignments was important for the long term. The fact that we went on for 14 months with the production of that assessment report. So some disappointments. The Wildfire Restoration Group dissolved at the end of 2016, but despite a voiced intent to keep it active. So currently there's no institutional template for what we did that would outlast the individuals involved in the 2015 fires. So as people retire and transfer and move on, if we had another one of these in a few years, none of the people are going to be around, or few of them will be, to know what we did in 2015. So I would call that a disappointment. Would have to be recreated from scratch. There's still no formalized structure in the state of Idaho for dealing with what we did. There was no economic impact analysis done for natural resource loss of private landowners. I thought this was a major shortcoming of the assessment report. It just didn't get done to show the economic impact. In fact, this was one of the impetus for doing that assessment report, that it was hoped that by showing the extent of the damage, 60,000 acres of non-industrial private land burned, that landowners would be more successful perhaps in getting assistance, loans, and cost share from agencies to, and maybe some appropriations to help their recover. And then I already mentioned kind of the politics. There was a little politics in this formalized group. I won't mention any names, but I do know that some of the agency representatives, there was some resentments between other agencies maybe taking on a little bit too much control or credit for what they were doing. You have that with any kind of entity like that, but it did exist. And then one of the last things I want to mention is that last year, this report was issued by the Academy of Arts and Sciences, United States Academy of Arts and Sciences, on science during crisis. And they dealt with situations, similar types, not just wildfire, but emergency type situations like we dealt with in 2015. And they came up with a list of recommendations in this report. And if you read those, these are basically what we did back in 2015. So there's some scholarship put into this that I guess you might say validated what we created on our own and on the fly back in 2015. This importance of rapid assessment, working with affected communities to get information to affected landowners and decision-making, interdisciplinary teams, interagency coordination and data sharing, centers of communication and information sharing, involving decision makers, maintaining flexibility and encouraging creativity, and taking account of the linkages between human communities, their economies and ecosystems. So these were all elements of what we did in 2015 that were highlighted in this report. Finally, I'll just mention the College of Agriculture created a YouTube video of this effort. They interviewed me on the YouTube, as well as a community leader in the area and a rancher whose timber was dramatically affected by the fire. So it is, if you want to see a video about it that recaps some of the effort, you can view that. I also published an article in the Journal of Extension, and the reference is there if you want to dig in a little more detail or have a written copy. I did share a PDF of that with Abby with Eden, and I don't know if she's able to send that out to attendees who are interested or not. But anyway, you can just go to Joe online and grab this article if you're interested. And so with that, I'll take questions. That's the end of my presentation. If folks have any questions or discussion you'd like to have, share your own experience with something similar, be happy to entertain those now.
Thank you, Bill. We will go ahead and take some questions now. And just a reminder, just type them into the chat box. And there are some questions already, Bill, if you're ready to answer.
You bet.
Okay, the first question, you mentioned not having a government agency to fill coordination goals for recovery. Is United States Forest Service state and private forestry in ID? Did they support you?
The Forest Service definitely did. I was not aware that it was specifically through that program. It could be in their internal accounting. That is how they were able to repurpose staff to work on private land. That could be. What I observed was primarily through the Forest Service staff themselves were eager to help out on this disastrous situation. I mean, the Forest Service office, in fact, the supervisor's office is in Kamei, which is one of the most dramatically affected communities in terms of home loss. So that's what I saw. I saw personal staff members all the way up to the supervisor taking initiative to do something outside the box. And I was told that the forest supervisor actually spoke with the chief of the Forest Service, who stopped off in Grangeville, which is a local community where these fires were at, after attending a memorial service for firefighters who were killed that same summer over in Washington State with the blow up. That was a really bad fire year in Washington too, as it was across the country. And she asked him if it was okay for her to repurpose staff to help on private lands. And he said, absolutely. Now that's what I heard through Forest Service staff. And that's what I observed. It could be through their internal accounting. They use that program in terms of budgets and so on and so forth, but I don't know that. They certainly help. That's the message I want to put out. The Forest Service really stepped up big time to help their neighbors on private land.
Thank you. And Abby has put in the chat that Bill's slides from today can be downloaded at the site that she put into the chat. So that answers several questions, Abby. Thank you. You also find a link to Bill's Journal of Extension article as well. So another question is, so was the United States Forest Service from the individual national forest? That would be different from the S&P forestry program, which is out of the national office.
Yeah, to my, there were no, all the people that I worked with who were members of our initial group and then this more formalized group of agency directors and county government were all from the local national forest, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest.
Okay, this person has had a really different interaction with each of these units.
With which units?
I guess I'm harping on this because we've had really different interactions with each unit, being the individual national forest compared to the United States Forest Service, I guess.
Maybe they're talking about the Washington office of the National Forest versus the local.
Correct. The national
Okay.
versus the local.
Yeah. You know, that I think what they're touching on is a bullet that I had in one of my slides about lessons learned. And that is the particular personality of the agency staff on that particular forest or that particular ranger district or whatever. In this case, it was the entire forest. As I mentioned, I'm actually in the process of a research project right now on a different topic, but it deals with the Forest Service's management locally. And one of the things that keeps coming up in the interviews that I'm conducting is this importance of the particular people involved. So I do not doubt that if this person had a situation, but dealing with a different forest, a different national forest that had different people involved, or if they were dealing with the Washington office, that their experience could have been very different. And that was the point of that bullet I had on one of my slides, is the individuals on that particular, in that particular agency or on that particular forest, I think would make a great difference. In our case, if the particular personalities within the Forest Service at our local national forest, the Nez Perce Clearwater National Forest, it's a big forest, 4 million acres. If they had been different people, it may not have turned out as positive as it did.
Okay. I'm waiting just a few more minutes for some more questions that people may have. Well, if we have covered all of our questions, Bill, I guess, is there anything you'd like to cover before we wrap up?
I don't really have anything. All I'll say is just thanks for everyone's attention. I hope that maybe you got some ideas or strategies on how you might address the same situation in your area. And if you think of questions later on or whenever, just shoot me an email. I'll be happy to entertain them.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. A reminder that this webinar will be archived on the Eden website and YouTube channel and distributed through the listserv. So please take a moment to complete the evaluation found at the link provided in the chat box and check your emails for upcoming webinars.